He had spent most of his life sitting in front of a piano, yet every time he touched the keys, the world still seemed to fall silent around him. People called him the greatest pianist alive, a title he never chased but ended up carrying like a shadow. From concert halls in Europe to grand theaters in Asia and America, he's performed for crowds who believed no one could ever match his skill. His fingers moved with such ease that it felt as if the piano listened to him rather than the other way around. On stage, he looked calm, confident, almost untouched by the noise of the world. The moment he played the first note, the hall would settle, and people leaned forward, waiting for a journey he alone could give. His talent was clear in every piece he performed, and the perfection in his music made people admire him even more. But inside him, something had started to feel different in recent years. The praise, the applause, the long tours that once excited him now felt strangely heavy. He never said it out loud, but he had begun to feel as if the music he played did not move him as deeply as it used to. One evening, after finishing a major concert in a huge hall filled with more than 3,000 people, he stood in the center of the stage with his hands resting at his sides, listening to the sound of the crowd cheering. They rose to their feet the moment he finished. It should have made him happy. It always had. But that night, he felt a strange emptiness, a feeling he could not fully explain even to himself as the applause went on. He bowed calm as always, but his mind was far away, drifting. When the curtains finally closed and he stepped backstage, the noise of the crowd faded. He walked through the hallway, nodding politely at the workers and musicians around him. They congratulated him, complimented him, and told him how powerful the performance had been. He smiled kindly, as he always did. But none of their words truly reached him. His assistant rushed up to him with a bottle of water and asked if he needed anything. He simply shook his head. Instead of returning to his dressing room, where a small celebration was already being set up, he slipped out a side exit. He did not do it to avoid people. He just wanted real air, quiet air, something that did not come with praise or noise or heavy expectations. Outside, the evening was cool. The street behind the concert hall was dim and empty at first glance. Streetlights flickered, and the sound of distant traffic hummed like a dull wave. He took a long breath, letting it fill his lungs. For a moment, he felt peaceful. Then he heard something. A piano. A single. Soft melody floated into the night air, carried by something deeper than sound emotion. At first, he thought it might be his imagination. Maybe someone nearby was playing a recording, but no. The notes were uneven, each one pressing forward gently, as if the person playing had no formal training yet carried a heart. Full of feeling, he turned his head slightly and listened harder. The tune came from somewhere near the alley on the left side of the building. It was strange. Who would play a piano there? And at this hour? Curiosity slowly pulled him forward. It was an old instinct, the kind he had almost forgotten. As a young boy, he used to follow any sound of a piano he heard, no matter where it came from. Back then, music felt like a treasure waiting in unexpected corners. Now, years later, he felt the same tugs, soft but undeniable. The alley was narrow and dim, lit only by a few old bulbs and the soft glow of a neon sign in the distance. He walked slowly, listening to the melody become clearer. It was fragile, yet haunting, like someone trying to speak through notes instead of words. As he reached the end of the alley, he finally saw it. An old upright piano, scratched and faded, sat near the wall of a cafe that had closed for the night. The paint was chipped. The keys were uneven, and the legs looked unstable. But someone sat there, playing with complete focus. The pianist's steps stopped on their own. The person playing was young, wearing simple clothes and slightly hunched over the keys. They weren't performing for anyone. They weren't trying to impress. They were simply playing, like they needed the melody the way someone needs air. He listened quietly, almost holding his breath. The melody wasn't complicated. It didn't have the sharp technique or elaborate layering that he was used to. It was simple, but in its simplicity, there was a kind of truth he hadn't heard in years. It felt raw, honest, It touched something inside him that his own flawless performances hadn't in a long time. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Even the distant traffic felt silent. It was just the pianist, the quiet street, and this unexpected melody that made him feel alive again. He stepped closer, careful not to disturb the player. But one small movement, one soft footstep, made the person turn around. They looked surprised, hands freezing above the keys. He raised his hand gently as if saying, "Please keep going." "I didn't mean to interrupt." The young player hesitated, unsure at first, but then turned back to the piano and began again. This time, the great pianist listened even more closely, trying to understand why the melody had struck him so deeply. Each note felt like a quiet confession, a memory, a piece of a story that was never spoken out loud. There were no perfect transitions, no polished dynamics yet. None of that mattered. The heart behind the music was stronger than any technique he had ever mastered. He felt something he rarely felt anymore, a sense of being humbled. When the melody reached its end, the alley fell silent again. The young player rested their hands on their lap and looked up shyly. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing next to the old piano. He saw now how worn out it really was. Some keys were chipped, some discolored, a few nearly broken. Yet from this imperfect instrument had come a sound that cut through his years of experience. "Where did you learn to play that?" he asked softly. The player looked down, almost embarrassed. "I didn't learn it anywhere. I just played what I felt. It came to me one night, so I kept trying until it sounded like this." He nodded slowly, not sure how to respond at first. He wasn't amazed because the tune was complex. He was amazed because it was real. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "Truly." The player smiled, shy but grateful. A breeze passed through the alley. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The music had already said more than words could. He stood there longer than he planned, listening to the faint echo of the melody replay inside his mind. Something in it refused to let go. It felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Not because he had heard the melody before, but because it stirred feelings he had ignored for years, feelings he thought he no longer had. Finally, whispered, "Thank you for playing. I didn't expect to hear something like that tonight." The young player nodded, unsure of what to say. He turned to leave, but after just 2 steps, he paused. The melody tugged at him again, like a quiet call. He looked back once more at the old piano, the dim alley, and the person who had just played something that shook him more than any concert he had done in years. Then he walked away. But the melody stayed with him, looping again and again inside his mind. He didn't know it yet, but that simple tune from a forgotten corner of the city was about to change his life in a way he never expected. The night after he heard the melody in the alley, found himself unable to sleep. It didn't matter how many times he closed his eyes or how many deep breaths he took. The tune kept returning, soft but steady, playing somewhere in the back of his mind. It was strange. He had played in front of presidents, kings, and thousands of people. Yet a simple melody from an old street piano was the thing keeping him awake. He sat up in his hotel room, the soft glow from the lamp casting a warm circle of light over the grand piano in the corner. The hotel always placed a piano in his room whenever he traveled, something he used to appreciate with pride. Tonight, though, the piano felt more like a challenge waiting for him. He walked over, sat down, and took a deep breath. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. He placed his fingers on the keys and slowly tried to replay the melody he had heard. The notes came out clean, perfect, almost too perfect. But something felt missing. He tried again, and again. He pressed the notes exactly in the order he remembered, yet the melody had none of the softness, none of the raw emotion he heard in the alley. Frustration quietly crept into his chest. For most of his life, he had been able to play anything he heard after listening just once. Composers admired him, teachers respected him, students looked up to him. But now, even as the world's greatest pianist, he could not capture the feeling of a tune played by someone who had never studied music formally. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. Why did it bother him so much? Why did a simple street melody reach him more deeply than all the complex pieces he had mastered? The answer didn't come, but the feeling didn't leave. The next morning, he went to rehearsals with the orchestra. Everyone greeted him with admiration, as usual. The conductor asked if he was ready to practice. He nodded, forcing a small smile. As he began playing, the orchestra following behind him, everything sounded right. Perfect, even. But in his mind, the alley melody slipped between the notes he was supposed to focus on. It felt as if the tune had carved a space inside him and refused to be overshadowed. Halfway through the rehearsal, he paused. His fingers hovered over the keys. The conductor looked at him. "Are you all right?" the conductor asked. He blinked and nodded again, even though he felt far from all right. He apologized softly and continued, pushing himself to stay present. But no matter how perfectly he played, the music felt empty. By the time rehearsal ended, he felt drained in a way he hadn't felt in years. After leaving the hall, he walked down the street slowly, hands in his pockets, head full of noise that wasn't really noise, just thoughts that refused to settle. Cars passed by, people rushed along the sidewalks, shops opened, and the city moved with its usual busy rhythm. But he felt separated from all of it. Eventually, he reached the alley again. He didn't plan to go there. His feet simply brought him back. He stood at the entrance and listened, hoping he might hear the tune again. But the alley was silent. The old piano still sat in the same place, chipped and crooked. But no one was there. He walked toward it and gently pressed one of the keys. It made a dull, flat sound. The piano felt cold, lifeless, so different from how it had sounded the night before. He looked around, hoping maybe the young player would appear from one of the nearby buildings. But there was no sign of them. The cafe was closed again. The street was empty. The air felt heavy. He stood still for a long moment, listening to a silence that somehow felt louder than sound. He didn't understand why he felt disappointed. He had only seen the player once. He didn't know their name, their story, where they lived, or why they had played so late at night. Yet he felt an ache in his chest, something close to longing, as he walked back toward the main street. He replayed everything about the moment he had heard the melody. The honesty in the notes, the emotion behind them, the vulnerability. It made him think of something he often ignored: his own beginnings. He remembered being a young boy, sitting at a piano that wasn't much better than the one in the alley. He remembered playing for the simple joy of hearing a sound he created. Back then, music wasn't a job or a duty or a performance. It was freedom. But somewhere along the years, while chasing perfection and meeting expectations, he had lost that feeling. He had traded the warmth of music for the pressure of being called the greatest. And now, one melody from a stranger had held up a mirror to him. Later that evening, he returned to the hotel again, but the restlessness was still there. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples. The melody played in his mind like a soft whisper he couldn't escape. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was gentle, like a memory asking to be heard. Finally, he stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out again. The sun had already set, and the night air felt cool against his face. The city lights flickered, and people moved around him like shadows. But he didn't care about any of it. He only cared about finding that tune again. This time he didn't go to the alley first. He walked around the block, listened near the cafes, the small squares, the street corners, anywhere someone might play. But he found nothing. He walked for nearly an hour before returning to the alley. Still empty, he stood there, staring at the old piano. A part of him felt foolish, but another part of him, the part he hadn't listened to in years, felt awake. He walked up to the piano again and pressed a few more keys. They sounded dull, but he didn't mind. He sat down on the old bench, which shook slightly under his weight. He placed his fingers on the keys and closed his eyes. He tried to play the melody once more, trying to feel it instead of just remembering it. He played slowly, gently, not with skill, but with a softness he rarely used. This time, The tune came out slightly better. Not perfect, not even close, but closer to what he had heard. Still, something was missing. He sighed and rested his hands in his lap. He could not explain the connection he felt to the melody. He had never heard something so simple affect him so deeply. For someone known for precision and perfection, it felt unsettling to struggle with a tune anyone else might have ignored. But he couldn't ignore it. No matter how hard he tried, as he sat there, a small breeze drifted through the alley, brushing against his face. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel it, the quiet, the stillness, the strange longing. Why did it matter so much? He didn't know yet. He only knew he needed to find the person who played it. Over the next few days, he went back to the alley again and again. Morning, afternoon, evening, late at night. Sometimes he stayed for only a few minutes. Other times, he sat for half an hour. Waiting, listening. People passing by looked at him with curiosity, wondering why a man dressed in fine clothes stood in such a forgotten corner of the city. But he didn't care what anyone thought. Each time he walked away without hearing the melody, the uneasy feeling inside him grew stronger. He didn't want the tune to become just a memory. He didn't want the moment in the alley to fade like a dream. He needed answers. He needed to understand why the melody felt like something he had been missing for years. On the 5th day of searching, he finally decided to ask the cafe owner about the piano. The owner was a middle-aged man cleaning the outdoor tables when he approached. "Excuse me," the pianist said gently. "Do you know who plays that piano at night?" The owner looked up, surprised. "People come sometimes, but mostly one person. Quiet kid. Comes late, plays for a while, then leaves. Doesn't bother anyone. Do you know where they live?" The owner shook his head. "No, but they sometimes help at the shelter 2 streets down. Maybe you'll find something there?" A spark of hope lit inside him. He thanked the owner and headed toward the shelter. As he walked, the melody grew louder in his mind, like it was guiding him forward. He didn't know what he would find or what he would say when he found the player. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something that pulled him forward. Not duty, not expectation. Not perfection, just feeling. And that alone was enough to keep him going. The shelter was small and simple, with an old sign hanging above the door and a few potted plants along the entrance. He stood outside for a moment, steadying his breath. The melody played softly in the back of his mind, the same way it had for days. It felt almost like it was pushing him forward, urging him to keep going. Inside, the shelter smelled of warm soup and freshly washed clothes. The walls were painted in light colors, and the air carried a quiet hum of soft conversation. Volunteers moved around, guiding people to tables, handing out food, offering blankets. There was a sense of calm in the place, gentleness that reminded him of childhood before. Music became work and pressure. He walked toward the front desk where a woman greeted people with a kind smile. She looked up when he approached. "Is there someone you're looking for?" she asked politely. He nodded. "I'm trying to find a young person who sometimes comes here. They play piano in the alley near the cafe down the street." The woman's smile softened with recognition. "Ah, yes. They come here often. Very quiet kid. Kind, too. They help with the children sometimes." His heart lifted slightly. "Are they here now?" She shook her head. "Not at the moment. But they usually come in the late afternoon." He thanked her and stepped aside, unsure what to do next. He didn't want to intrude, but he also didn't want to leave. So he found a small corner where he could sit without drawing too much attention. From there, he watched people move around, children laughing softly, parents whispering comforting words to their little ones, volunteers working with gentle patience. It was a place full of emotion, and somehow it made the melody in his mind even clearer. Hours passed quietly. The sun began to set, and the sky turned a soft orange. Just when he started to think maybe he had come too early or too late, the door opened. He looked up. There they were. The young player entered carrying a small bag over their shoulder. Their clothes were simple, worn but clean. Their eyes looked slightly tired but gentle. They walked toward the back of the shelter, not noticing him at first. He stood up, his heart suddenly beating a little faster. It felt strange to feel nervous. He had performed on the biggest stages, yet approaching this young player felt harder than stepping in front of thousands of people. He walked toward them slowly. When he reached a few steps behind them, he said softly, "Excuse me?"
What?
The young player turned, and for a moment, surprise filled their face. They clearly remembered him. The alley. The piano. The quiet moment they shared. "You," the player whispered. "You were there that night." He nodded. "Yes, I've been hoping to see you again." The young player looked down shyly, unsure of what to say. Their hands tightened around the strap of their bag. "I've been thinking about your melody every day," he continued gently. "I can't get it out of my mind." The player's eyes widened slightly, as if they could not believe someone like him would think about their music at all. "Why?" they asked quietly. He took a breath, searching for the right words. "Because it's honest, raw. It touched something in me that I haven't felt in years." The young player said nothing for a moment. Then, slowly they nodded. I didn't think anyone would ever really listen," the player admitted. "I just play because it helps me feel less alone. I didn't expect someone like you to hear it," he smiled, not proudly but warmly. "Sometimes the best music comes from people who don't expect anyone to hear them." The young player looked up at him, unsure but curious. He gently asked, "Would you play it for me again?" "Not in the alley. Somewhere quieter, if you don't mind." The young player hesitated, then nodded slowly. There was a small room in the back of the shelter with an old upright piano. The volunteers used it during activities with the children. It wasn't in good condition, but it worked well enough for simple songs. They walked there together. When they entered, the room felt warm, with walls decorated with colorful drawings made by children who visited the shelter. The young player sat at the piano. The bench shook slightly, the same way the alley piano bench had. They placed their fingers on the keys, took a quiet breath, and began playing. The melody filled the room, soft and pure, drifting through the quiet air. And once again, he felt that same deep emotion pull at his heart, feeling he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. He closed his eyes and listened fully. No audience, no stage, no pressure, just him and a melody that felt like the truth. When the player finished, the room went silent. He opened his eyes slowly. "That's the one," he whispered. "That's exactly what I heard." The young player looked down, almost embarrassed. "I'm not trained. I don't even know if I'm playing the notes right." He shook his head. "It's not about that. Music isn't just technique. It's feeling. And you have that." The young player's eyes softened. "I just play what I feel. That's all." He sat beside them on the bench, gently testing the keys even though some were out of tune. "Can you teach it to me?" he asked. The young player froze a little. "Teach you?" They sounded almost stunned. "Yes," he said gently. "I tried to play it in my hotel room. Many times, but I could never get it right. I realized something was missing. I want to learn from you." The young player stared at him with disbelief. Slowly, a small, uncertain smile appeared. "I can try," they whispered. He nodded, grateful. They spent the next hour working through the melody together. The young player showed him the notes, but more importantly, they explained the feeling behind each part, the sadness that shaped the beginning, the hope that lifted the middle, the quiet acceptance that softened the end. He listened carefully, not just with his ears, but with his heart. For once, he wasn't the one teaching, he wasn't the one leading. He was simply learning, quietly, humbly. When he tried playing it again, the tune still wasn't perfect, but it felt closer, much closer. The young player listened, nodding slightly. "Better," they murmured. "But you're thinking too much." "Don't think. Just feel it." He laughed softly. "I've been thinking for so many years that I might have forgotten how not to." The young player gave a small, understanding smile. They continued practicing until the shelter began closing for the evening. He didn't want to leave, but he also didn't want to make things difficult for them as they walked out together. He said, "Thank you. Truly, you've given me something I didn't know I needed." The young player looked down, shy once more. "I'm glad it helped, even a little." He paused, then said carefully, "I have a concert in 3 days. It's one of the biggest of the season. I want you to come." The young player's eyes widened. "Me? But I've never gone to something like that. And I don't have tickets," or he interrupted gently. "I'll take care of everything. I just want you there." The young player hesitated. "Why?" He smiled softly. "Because you reminded me why music matters." The young player looked down, their fingers tightening around their bag strap again. After a long moment, they nodded. "I'll come." He felt relieved. "Good." Before they parted ways, he asked one last question. "That melody, the one you played, does it have a name?" The young player shook their head. "No, it's just something I made when things were hard." He nodded. "Maybe you should name it." The young player thought for a moment, then said softly, "Maybe one day." He gave them a gentle nod and watched as they walked away down the quiet street. The sky was dark now, stars barely peeking through the city lights. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the cool night air. The melody no longer haunted him. It guided him, and he knew deep inside that something had shifted in him forever. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew the journey wasn't over. Not for him, not for the young player, and certainly not for the melody that had changed everything. The morning after everything changed felt different for her. She woke up before the sun had even started to rise, and for a moment she just lay there staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the sounds from the previous night, the unexpected applause, the surprised faces, the whispering crowd that slowly turned into loud cheers. She still couldn't believe it actually happened. It all felt like a dream that might fade if she tried to think too hard about it. She sat up slowly, as if the world around her was fragile and could break with one wrong move. Her hands rested on her lap, still remembering the keys they had touched. Even after sleeping, her fingers felt warm, almost buzzing. It was the kind of feeling people talked about when they said something was meant for them. As she got out of bed, her thoughts jumped back to the maestro. She could still see his face clearly, the shock in his eyes. The way his smile slowly faded as he listened, and the quiet moment afterward when he didn't say anything at all. She didn't know what that silence meant. Was he proud? Was he confused? Or was he worried that her talent could change things he wasn't ready for? She tried not to guess. Guessing always made her nervous, so she took a deep breath and walked to the small kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. The room felt peaceful, but her heart wasn't ready to rest yet. Later that morning, she walked to the music hall again. Her steps were slower than usual. The cold air brushed against her skin and made her even more alert. She kept thinking about what would happen when she got there. Would the maestro speak to her? Would the others treat her differently now? Or would they all pretend nothing happened? When she reached the building, she stood by the door for a long moment. She didn't realize she was holding her breath till she pushed the door open and let the warm air inside hit her face. Inside the hall, the students were already practicing. Their music echoed off the high walls, mixing into something that sounded almost like a storm. But even in that storm, she felt calm. She walked quietly to her usual corner, hoping she could slip in without anyone making a big deal out of what happened. But that hope didn't last long. One of the students noticed her first. He elbowed the person beside him and pointed. "Welcome back," he said with a smile that looked half excited and half unsure. Others began to turn. Some nodded politely. Some whispered. A few stared at her with the kind of expression she had never seen on their faces before, something between respect and curiosity. She gave a small smile, the kind that said she wasn't sure how to react yet. She just wanted to sit, warm her hands, and wait for the maestro, like she always did. When he finally stepped into the room, the energy changed instantly. It always changed when he walked in, but today it felt different. Today, everyone watched him closely to see how he would behave after the previous night. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he placed his notes on the stand and cleared his throat. Then he lifted his eyes and stopped when he saw her. She felt her stomach twist. He took a few steps toward her, slow but steady, and the room became silent. "Good morning," he said. She nodded. "Good morning." There was a small pause, and it felt like the whole room held its breath. "Last night," he said, "you surprised a lot of people?" Her fingers tightened slightly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." He shook his head. "You didn't. In fact, you did the opposite." His expression softened a little. "Your playing was nothing like what I expected. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was real, honest." He looked toward the students. And sometimes honesty is stronger than perfection. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't even sure if he was praising her or warning her. Then he added, "But unexpected moments can change the direction of things. And now you have a choice to make." He stepped closer. "Do you want to continue learning quietly? Or are you ready to step forward and be seen?" The question felt like a door opening, and she didn't feel ready to walk through it. Being seen was not something she had ever wanted. She preferred shadows, corners, quiet places, where no one looked at her too closely. But after last night, hiding felt impossible. "I don't know," she said honestly. He nodded. "That is an answer to, you don't have to decide today. But you should understand something." His voice grew quieter, but heavier. "If you keep playing the way you did, people will look at you. You can't avoid that anymore." She lowered her gaze. I just want to play." "Then play," he said. "But understand that music speaks louder than silence." He walked back to the front of the room and began the lesson like everything was normal. But nothing felt normal to her. Every note she played felt like it carried weight. Every glance she received felt sharper. Still, she tried to focus. She followed the instructions, listened to the rhythm, and let her fingertips remember the things they learned before she even knew they were learning. As the hours passed, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Some of the students looked at her with respect, yes, but others looked different. Their eyes carried a mix of envy and confusion. They weren't angry, but they seemed unsure what her presence meant. For them, for the group, for the future. That afternoon, she stayed behind after the lesson ended. She sat at the piano alone, letting her fingers roam freely. She didn't realize the maestro was still in the room until he spoke. "Why do you play like that?" he asked. She turned slightly. "Like what?" "Like you're telling a story you've never spoken aloud." She hesitated. "Maybe I am." He walked closer. "Then tell it. Don't hide it in the notes. Make it clear. Make it strong." He paused. "But be prepared. When people hear a story that powerful, they expect more. They want more. That is the price of talent." "I didn't ask for talent," she said quietly. "Nobody does," he replied. "But once it appears, you have to decide what you're going to do with it." She turned to the keys again, letting his words settle into her chest. She didn't know the answer. She didn't know if she ever would. Over the next few days, everything changed. The music hall felt different. Whenever she entered, the room fell into a strange silence before quickly returning to normal. People who never spoke to her before began offering smiles or small nods. A few even asked questions about how long she had been practicing or what pieces she liked. She didn't have real answers for them. She played because it felt right, because it felt like breathing, because something deep inside her responded to the instrument as if they shared the same heartbeat. One evening, when she was practicing alone again, she heard footsteps. She assumed it was the maestro, but when she looked up, she saw someone else, one of the students who rarely spoke. He stood by the door, awkward and unsure. "Can I listen? Just for a little?" She nodded. He sat quietly, and she played. When she finished, he didn't clap or say anything loud. He just smiled and whispered, "It helps me. When I hear you play, it makes things feel softer." That simple sentence warmed her more than the applause had, but not everyone reacted with warmth. Later that week, she overheard two students whispering near the hallway. She came out of nowhere. "He's giving her too much attention. What if she takes the spot we've been working for?" Their words stung, even though they didn't say them directly to her. She walked away quietly, but the voices stayed with her long after she left the building. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the dark sky. She wondered if the maestro had put her in a difficult position without meaning to. Or maybe he did mean to. Maybe he wanted her to face the world that came with talent. The next morning, she went to the hall earlier than usual. She wanted time to think, time to breathe. When she reached the piano, she touched the keys gently, as if asking them for guidance. The maestro entered a few minutes later. "You're early," he said. "I couldn't sleep." He studied her carefully. "Tell me what's wrong." She hesitated, then said, "Some people think I'm getting things I don't deserve." He nodded slowly, as if he expected that. People always talk when something new appears. When something threatens their idea of how things should be. She swallowed. "What if I'm not ready?" "You're not," he said immediately. "No one ever is." But readiness isn't what makes someone special. It's how they react when the world starts paying attention. She didn't know if that made her feel better or worse. "Listen," he said, moving closer. "If you want to quit, I won't stop you. If you want to stay, I'll guide you. But whatever you choose it for yourself, not for them." His words felt steady, like a hand she could hold even in the dark. She looked at the piano again. The keys looked back at her, silent but inviting. And in that moment, she realized something she had never said out loud. She didn't play for applause. She didn't play to be seen. She didn't play to prove anything. She played because the music felt like the only place she could breathe freely. I want to stay," she whispered. The maestro nodded once firmly. "Then stay. And let the music speak for you." As the sun slowly rose outside the tall windows, she placed her fingers on the keys. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from understanding. This was only the beginning. Whatever came next, admiration, envy, pressure, applause, she was ready to face it. Not because she felt strong, not because she felt confident, but because the music inside her refused to be silent anymore. The night of the concert arrived with a kind of quiet intensity he had not felt in years. Usually, before walking onto a stage, he carried confidence like a shield. Tonight was different. Tonight he felt something softer, something that made his chest feel full and oddly calm at the same time. Backstage, people moved quickly, stage managers checking lights, assistants fixing last-minute details, musicians tuning their instruments. Yet even with all the noise, his thoughts stayed centered on one thing. Were they here? He kept glancing toward the side halls, hoping for a glimpse of the young player. The memory of their melody stayed with him, steady like a heartbeat. It had been days since they had practiced together in the shelter's small room. But the tune had never faded. When the stage director approached and said, "You're on in 5, he nodded, but kept looking toward the entrance. Then, finally, he saw them. The young player stood near the last row of seats, looking both amazed and overwhelmed by the size of the hall. They wore simple clothes, the same bag slung over their shoulder. Their eyes darted around, taking everything in. Relief washed over him. He lifted his hand to wave quietly. The young player saw him and gave a small, shy nod. That was enough. He inhaled deeply and stepped toward the stage. The lights dimmed. The audience settled. The doors closed softly behind the ushers. A heavy silence fell across the hall, the kind that made every breath feel loud. When he walked onto the stage, the hall erupted into applause. But unlike every other time, he didn't let the sound fill him with pride or nerves. He simply bowed, sat at the piano, and placed his fingers on the keys. The first half of the performance went as expected. Famous pieces he had mastered long ago. The audience loved them, clapping warmly after every section. But the whole time, his heart waited for one moment, the moment he knew would matter most. After the final encore piece, he paused. The hall stayed silent, expecting him to stand and bow. Instead, he spoke softly into the microphone. "There is one more piece," he said. "One that is special to me." People shifted in their seats, curious. "It doesn't have a name," he continued, "but it carries truth. And sometimes truth is the only thing worth playing." He looked toward the young player in the last row. Their eyes widened in shock. He gave the smallest nod. Then he began. The first notes were shaky, not from fear, but from feeling. The melody was raw, different from the polished music he usually played. It rose slowly, built gently, shaped by emotion rather than technique. He played the sadness the young player had described. He played the softness in the middle, the kind that wrapped around the heart. And he played the ending, the quiet lift that felt like hope finally finding its way home. The hall stayed completely still. He had performed in many places, for crowds of all sizes, but he had never felt an audience listen like this. They weren't just hearing the notes, they were feeling them, and he knew without looking that the young player heard something different, something deeper. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was almost unreal. Then the applause came. It was louder than anything he had heard in years. People stood. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. But none of that mattered as much as one thing. He looked back toward the last row. The young player wasn't clapping. They were standing still, frozen with emotion, their hand over their mouth, eyes glistening, and he knew he had done justice to their melody. After the show ended, people surrounded him backstage, praising the performance, asking about the last piece, wondering where it came from. But he slipped away as soon as he could, moving down the side hall where he hoped to find them. He stepped into the lobby. The young player stood near the exit. As if unsure whether to stay or run, he walked toward them. "You played it," they said quietly, almost breathless. He nodded. "It deserved to be heard." The young player lowered their gaze. "I didn't think you would actually include it. Not in a hall like this." He stepped closer. "Why shouldn't I? Your melody carries more truth than most music I've ever played." They shook their head. "But I'm nobody. I don't even know how to read sheet music properly. I just play what I feel." He smiled warmly. "That's exactly why it matters. Music begins with feeling. Everything else comes later." The young player looked at him, then truly looked on. He saw a mix of disbelief, gratitude, and fear in their eyes. "I don't know what to do next," they admitted softly. "I never thought any of this could happen." He nodded understandingly. "You don't have to decide anything right now, but if you want, I can help you learn. Not to change you, not to shape you into something else. Just to give you tools. Your feeling is already there. Your heart already knows what it's doing." The young player hesitated. Then, slowly, they nodded. "I'd like that," they whispered. He felt a quiet warmth fill him. Before they could say anything more, a group of people approached, calling his name, eager to speak to him. He turned back to the young player. "Wait for me?" he asked. They nodded once again. Minutes later, after handling the necessary conversations, he returned to find them still standing there, patiently waiting. "Let's get some air," he said. The two stepped outside into the cool night. The street was calm, the city lights glowing softly. They walked without speaking at first, letting the quiet settle around them. Finally, the young player asked, "Why did you come looking for me in the first place?" He took a moment before answering. "Because your melody reminded me of something I lost," he said simply. "And I wanted to understand why." They tilted their heads slightly. "And did you?" He smiled faintly. "Yes, I think I did." They walked slowly along the sidewalk, passing the closed shops and quiet corners. The young player looked down at their hands. "I wrote that melody on a day when everything felt like it was falling apart," they said. "I didn't know how to say what I was feeling, so I played it instead. I never thought anyone would hear it," he nodded. "But I did. And it reached me." The young player breathed in deeply, then said, "Maybe music finds people who need it." He smiled. "Yes, I believe that." They continued walking until they reached a bench by a fountain. The soft sound of water made the moment feel peaceful. "I don't know much about the world of music like you do," the young player said, "but I want to learn. I want to know how to make my feelings into something more." He sat beside them. "And I want to help you do that. Only if you want it." They nodded softly. "I do." He placed his hands on his knees, looking up at the night sky. "Then we'll start at your pace, your way, not the world's way." The young player's shoulders relaxed. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then, very softly, the young player said, "I think I finally have a name for the melody." What is it? The young player looked ahead, eyes calm, voice steady. The tune that found me. He felt something warm settle in his chest. That's perfect, he whispered. They both sat quietly, letting the night wrap around them. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a people who had found something rare, a connection born from sound, truth, and the courage to feel. And in that stillness, he realized something important. The melody he once could neither ignore nor defeat had never been a challenge. It had been a calling, and he had finally answered it.